Good morning, Noodleheads. We are going to be continuing our deep dive week into David Foster Wallace, a supposedly funny thing I'll never do again. Today we're going to be looking at the title essay, a titular trip he took for Harper's onto a cruise ship, and kind of panned the cruise ship, but also it continues on with these ideas of essentially the infantilization of Americans through like the overwhelming amount of entertainment and distraction and just general babying and coddling of the public and the mind. So let's dig right into it. We'll get into our reading mode and we will pull up the essay and the notes. If you're just joining me for the first time, welcome. We're going to be talking books, film, and culture and doing a little bit of critique, so it should be a good time. A supposedly fun thing I will never do again. This essay was a real sort of game changer, or at least career maker for Wallace. It really affected sort of how he was viewed, and it was on every college syllabus within sort of 5 or 10 years, and it almost sort of made his name as an essay writer or a journalist. And the idea, as he mentioned in the interview we looked at yesterday, where he was on Charlie Rose, he was sort of this big floating eye in the sky. Not really like a panopticon surveillance sense, but more of the, the sense that he's omnipresent, all-seeing. And also in some ways he admits that he played up this first-person perspective of sort of being a dolt or a naif or... a kind of noodlehead in his own way. So let's get into it. He literally starts this one chronologically, I believe. So he does this beautiful and famous recounting of being on a beach scene, which I think is a bit of a take off Kincaid, but we can get into that later. She has a very famous essay she wrote in the second person, you. It's kind of a post-colonial takedown of the tourism industry, which is also awesome and be good to get into. But let's start with our first quote here. I've seen sucrose beaches and water of very bright blue. I've seen an all-red leisure suit with flared lapels. I've smelled what suntan lotion smells like spread over 21,000 pounds of hot flesh. I've been addressed as Mon in 3 different nations. I've watched 500 upscale Americans dance the electric slide. I've seen sunsets that looked computer-enhanced and a tropical moon that looked more like a sort of obscenely large and dangling lemon than like the good old stony U.S. moon I'm used to. I have, very briefly, joined a conga line. I've got to say, I feel like there's been a kind of Peter principle in effect on this assignment. A certain swanky East Coast magazine approved of the results of sending me to a plain old simple state fair last year to do a directionless, essayish thing. So now I get offered this tropical plum assignment with the exact same paucity of direction or angle. But this time there's this new feeling of pressure. Total expenses for the state fair were $27, excluding games of chance. This time, Harper's has shelled out over 3,000 USD before seeing pithy, sensuous description 1. They keep saying on the phone, ship to shore, very patiently, not to fret about it. They are sort of disingenuous, I believe, these magazine people. They say all they want is a sort of really big experiential postcard. Go, plow the Caribbean in style. Come back, say what you've seen. So, this opening, it really launches you into the oeuvre of DFW if you've never read him before. It's overly descriptive, hyper-realistic, beautiful, sensuous, verbose, and to some extent, there is a little bit of disingenuous as well, because he's so just like dripping with irony and cynicism, laden with that sort of Gen Xer vibe that has really gone out of fashion, or at least become retro, right? The idea of being that sort of cynical or sarcastic in what is essentially an upscale, elitist, academic kind of magazine. Harper's, if you don't know it, it's still around. It's famously funded by a sort of wealthy patron, and so it kind of has been. And it's one of the oldest magazines in America, too. 173 years old, according to the website here. But classy, don't be a fool. Well, I'm a fool. I am definitely a noodlehead. That's my whole raison d'etre. But this is the take. The eviction expert. Can a city stop a housing crisis? MAGA meets the age of Aquarius. Crime and punishment. Can American policing be fixed? So it's these sort of very scholarly, erudite, and sometimes esoteric takes on contemporary news, politics, literature, the art world, this type of thing. And they have a podcast now. It's pretty nice. It's good. Highly recommend if you're into that kind of thing. And the other thing they have, which is incredible, is a 170-year-old online archive. So just looking at this list of names on their authors, Ian Baruma, famous East Asia correspondent, Edward Danticat, the Haitian writer, award winner, Lydia Davis, one of the most famous, successful contemporary short story writers. It's a hit list of big name writers. And when Wallace joined this group, it was definitely, his introduction to the literary world of America. Yeah, look at that. Tom Bissell, Crumb. The Crumb is listed on their page. Jesus. Classic stuff here. Really great magazine. But again, it's also not really for profit. Michel Houellebecq, oof. The Frenchman, always causing a row. A shapeshifter and a troublemaker. Yeah, this is cool to take a list at these. So, I recommend checking it out if you haven't seen it. Alice McDermott, too. David Means. These are big name people in the world that David Foster Wallace both identified himself as being a part of and really sort of wanted to be a part of, right? He talked also that interview on Charlie Rose about this idea that his identity is more as a fiction writer than as a journalist. So when he went to do pieces like this Caribbean piece, this cruise ship piece, which is essentially, it's not even a review, it's really just a sort of, semi-advertisement experiential deal. He had a, crisis of his moral or ethical standards as an artist, right? He certainly views himself as the artist, that thing, that ideal of a solitary male aloneness. And then we're going to see in our next passage too, he directly references Hemingway, who is at the fore of that line, that through line of American white guys who won big awards and accolades with their writing and their machismo too. I've seen the north of coast of Jamaica. I've seen and smelled all 145 cats inside the Ernest Hemingway residence in Key West, Florida. I now know the difference between straight bingo and prizo and what it is when a bingo jackpot snowballs. I've seen camcorders that practically required a dolly. So again, he gets into this idea of the high and the low. He's quite famous for this, or was quite famous for blending this sort of incredible verbose vocabulary that was just, the full breadth of the English language, and really also incorporated the low or the conversational, the American plain speak, the technical jargon and talk of work culture. And I think, it's hard to say his books or his writing was actually for the everyman. Certainly Harper's Magazine is not for the every American man. And certainly Infinite Jest, his most famous work, is fairly unapproachable. I guess the most accessible entry point for his work would have been The New Yorker, which is itself a very New York liberal leftist sort of magazine of the elite. It's not really that popular in the broader scheme of things. Okay, so he continues. His idea is basically we're stepping into the big-footed sneakers of David Foster Wallace and getting behind his glasses and having a look at what this experience is. I have, in dark moods, viewed and logged every type of erythema, keratinosis, pre-melanomic lesion, liver spot, eczema, wart, papular cyst, potbelly, femoral, cellulite, varicosity, collagen, and silicone enhancement, bad tint hair transplants that have not taken, i.e., I have seen nearly naked a lot of people I would prefer not to have seen nearly naked. I felt as bleak as I've felt since puberty and have filled almost 3 Mead notebooks trying to figure out whether it was them or just me. I've acquired and nurtured a potentially lifelong grudge against the ship's hotel manager, whose name was Mr. Dermatis, and whom I now and henceforth christen Mr. Dermatitis, an almost reverent respect for my waiter, and a searching crush on the cabin steward for my part of Deck 10's port hallway, Petra, she of the dimples and broad, candid brow, who always wore a nurse's starched and rustling whites and smelled of the cedary Norwegian disinfectant she swabbed bathrooms down with, and who cleaned my cabin with a centimeter of its life at least 10 times a day, but could never be caught in the actual act of cleaning. A figure of magical and abiding charm, and well worth a postcard all her own. So I didn't even realize I was going to be reading that long, but again, we see these passages that just sort of continue to snake. They're serpentine almost, they're rollicking, and they do get into a kind of poetic, Whitman-esque, I think, continuation where you roll with them. Remember maybe also William Carlos Williams, him across the bridge in New Jersey. It's, Foster Wallace in all of his writing is speaking to the American pantheon. He is extremely self-aware and self-referential, that every piece of art he made, to him was about, will this be read in 100 years, right? He had that idea in his mind, and, I think it suffered, him personally and probably his work, that he didn't have the sort of lightness or breeziness that we associate now with content and publishing. At the time, even this idea of having a fun little cruise ship, almost sinks him. Literally, figuratively. He takes it so seriously. And it is also, in a way, what makes his work special, and it makes it a kind of relic now, that we don't see this kind of, insistence on perfect diction and 70 pages when you're covering something mundane and quotidian like a cruise ship. Okay, so he now, of course, this is the other thing he does, right? He inflects his writing with the personal in a way that is sometimes positive and sometimes, I guess what you'd call cringy now, like him talking about the deck cabin woman who's doing the cleaning the room, and his sort of tame but still sexualized fantasy of her is not very popular these days. That kind of thing is faux pas. But then he does inflect, of course, his I, both the EYE and the capital I, into this narrative. It's very much about him as much as it's about the cruise ship. It's about how he feels, how he emotes, the anxiety, and ultimately sort of depressing nature of being pampered and babied, and how he feels that's affecting American culture. So now he's getting back to this sort of anecdotal reflection on childhood. In school, I ended up writing 3 different papers on the castaway section of Moby Dick, the chapter where the cabin boy Pip falls overboard and is driven mad by the empty immensity of what he finds himself floating in. And when I teach school now, I always teach Crane's horrific open boat, and I get bent out of shape when the kids find the story dull or jaunty adventurous. I want them to feel the same marrow-level dread of oceanic I've always felt. The intuition of the sea as primordial nada, bottomless, depths inhabited by cackling, tooth-studded things rising toward you at the rate a feather falls. Anyway, hence the atavistic shark fetish, which I need to admit came back with a long-repressed vengeance on this luxury cruise, and that I made such a fuss about the one possible dorsal fin I saw off starboard that my companions at supper's table 64 finally had to tell me, with all possible tact, to shut up about the fin already. Uh, Revisiting these essays I have to admit, is fun for me. It's indulgent. And it's also interesting to see now that just the time they require of the reader, just sentence by sentence, it's taking minutes for me to read a sentence or two out loud. And that kind of indulgence in our current attention economy, where we just have a deficit, a real like paucity of time. The odd thing about our time is that as it's being fragmented and fractioned into smaller and smaller chunks and bits and pieces, right? I mean, an advertisement used to be 30 seconds or whatever. If the commercial break hit in television, you knew you had 2.5 minutes to go to the kitchen, get a snack, go to the bathroom, whatever. And now, on YouTube, you're talking 3-minute bumper ads, or sorry, 3-second bumper ads, right? It's talking about pieces of time that are so small. And it inflects everything. It gets that McLuhanite idea of the medium being the message, where each little morsel and chunk of information is shrunk and divided into smaller and smaller pieces. But it puts us on this sort of Sisyphean task, right? Where, the hill always gets a little bit higher each time we climb one step farther. Or what's the idea of a line that keeps dividing and never meets? It's asymptotic, right? An asymptotic line is when, that classical fable where if you divide it in half, divide it in half, divide it in half, the thing gets smaller and smaller and smaller, but you also never reach zero. It's infinite. There's no end. And I think that's where we're at sometimes with our cultural consumption now. There's no end to it. And we can just keep breaking it up and chunking it down, but it's not going anywhere. And Foster Wallace, I think, here, almost 30, 35 years ago now, is hinting at this idea or getting towards it. And certainly in the title of Infinite Jest, we feel that too, right? He had a real, even though he was doing it and taking part in the culture, he had a real issue with cynicism and sarcasm and, as he said earlier in this essay, disingenuousness, right? He was put off by the people he's working for, the magazine editors who are hiring him, because of their lack of conviction. And certainly in his art, he did have conviction, which is nice for us as the reader. I don't think it's an accident that luxury cruises appeal mostly to older people. I don't mean decrepitly old, but I mean like age 50 plus people, for whom their own mortality is something more than an abstraction. A little farther down now. Not so the Megaline ships. It's not an accident they're all so white and clean, for they're clearly meant to represent the Calvinist triumph of capital and industry over the primal decay action of the sea. So Calvinism, if you're not familiar, of course, is this idea in the Christian church of Reformation and Protestantism in Europe that ultimately led to extreme minimalism or simplisticness, right? So just plain white walls, no decoration, simple wooden crosses, spread across Northern Europe, and really this idea of sort of, that work is the thing next to God, that cleanliness is next to God, the idea that work and improvement, and also, putting your head down and grinding it, putting it to the axe stone and grinding it is going to get you ahead in life and also sort of keep you straight or clean or sober. It's interesting to think about, too, how much that Calvinist inflection is present today in the self-help people and all of the people who are, trying to sell you supplements or whatever and telling you that you need a clean body, clean life. It's quite interesting. There's a huge movement now, I think, towards sobriety and asceticism. You see it in vegan culture and also in dry or sober culture of not drinking alcohol. But these things come in waves and cycles and generations. This is what he's talking about here. This idea of the old people on the ship, and then, the idea that rust and decay and decrepitude is going to show them their own fallibility, is going to show them their mortality and scare them. So instead, they're keeping it white, clean, pristine, there's an analogy or a parallel here, certainly to hospital lights and tucked bed sheets. This passage is talking a little bit about defining a vacation, what it means to take time off and to be on break. I think also in a world where we're already kind of swallowed up by leisure. Like, he was a big reader, and some of the other essays in this book reference Neil Postman, what is Postman's favorite work? It's I think Entertaining Ourselves to Death, something like that. Neil Postman, Amusing Ourselves to Death. It's a great book, really heavily referenced in a lot of David Foster Wallace's work, and then later Technopoly. Highly recommend both. But Postman distinguishes the Orwellian vision of the future in which totalitarian governments seize individual rights from that offered by Huxley in Brave New World, where people medicate themselves into bliss. So drawing an analogy with the later scenario, i.e. that we're all like blissed out on too much entertainment and drugs, Postman sees television's entertainment value as a present-day soma. And this would continue on for, social media as soma, the fictitious pleasure drug in Brave New World, by means of which the citizens' rights are exchanged for consumer entertainment. So chew on that one. Are citizens' rights exchanged for consumer entertainment today? I think it's pretty prescient and prevalent. That form excludes the content. Is a particular medium can only sustain a particular level of ideas. So this really gets back to this idea of dividing time and attention. That, if we're going in on this short-term thing or clips, you're only going to get a clipped understanding of reality. So, here's the thing, says David Foster Wallace. A vacation is a respite from unpleasantness, and since consciousness of death and decay are unpleasant, it may seem weird that Americans' ultimate fantasy vacation involves being plunked down in an enormous primordial engine of death and decay. He's talking about the sea here, not the ship. But on a 7NC luxury cruise, we're skillfully enabled in the construction of various fantasies of triumph over just this death and decay. One way to triumph is via the rigors of self-improvement, and the crew's amphetaminic upkeep of the nadir is an unsubtle analog to personal titivation, diet, exercise, megavitamin supplements, cosmetic surgery, Franklin Quest time management seminars, etc. I think this too connects to this just wild phenomena of physical health and life advice. It's really common, of course, for young men and in sort of the podcasting world of Joe Rogan and, Tim Ferriss and now Andrew Huberman, who's just sort of sharply and acutely made subject to a takedown piece at the New York Magazine. Maybe even to people like Andrew Tate, who I'm less familiar with, but I know is like, an idol of worship to children. And I think he was a kind of like crummy mid-level kickboxer or something who then, basically promoted misogynistic pimping values. So this idea of diet, exercise, and megavitamin supplements being the cure, this fix to old age or to maturity is a real issue. Because ultimately it means people are trying to put off aging. And when you put off aging, it means you put off becoming an adult. You put off becoming responsible and grown, which is not a great thing in society. So we continue. Let's talk about the staff now, taking care of them. This idea of pampering. They'll micromanage every iota of every pleasure option so that not even the dreadful corrosive action of your adult consciousness and agency and dread can F up your fun. Your troublesome capacities for choice, error, regret, dissatisfaction, and despair will be removed from the equation. The ads promise that you will be able, finally, for once, truly to relax and have a good time. because you'll have no choice but to have a good time. No choice but to have a good time, and no adult consciousness or agency. It's interesting that he's talking about this idea of dopamine and sort of coming to a biological or chemical hormonal argument. This is like a huge wave of this has passed through our culture, sort of, quack doctors and fake science, like Huberman, right? Who's an ophthalmologist. He's an eye doctor. And he gives people whatever, dating advice, workout advice, life advice, and is essentially practicing a form of like talk therapy, but it's talk therapy that's, somewhat fallaciously embedded in supposedly hard science. I mean, this is also, I really like Tim Ferriss and his idea of promoting education and lifelong learning, but I do think that his effect, right? You can have good intentions, and I think Tim Ferriss has good intentions and has done a lot of good things for a lot of people, and he has an honest interest in his interviewees. In other words, Tim Ferriss has intentionally spread other people's ideas, including someone like Huberman, but it can lead to negative places, right? The classic, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And to some extent, the culture that's come from that has spawned this sort of, out of control obsession with supplements, multivitamins, whatever, the time managed diet and all this sort of fad, trendy stuff. And then it bakes into this idea that it's like hard science is what's giving you this advice, as opposed to just like some guy on the internet, which is what it is. It's just some guy on the internet. And it's usually really simple advice too. Like a friend insisted I read one of Jordan Peterson's book, and it was the 12 Rules book. It's the same thing. It's simple platitudes, that anyone who had read the Bible would have, or even just gone to church. You don't even have to have read the whole Bible. If you've just gone to church at any point in your life for a couple of years, you'll already have any of that piece of advice in Peterman's book. It is going to be simple knowledge, golden rule, do unto the others as you would do unto yourself, make your bed, be clean, this type of stuff. It's Calvinist, right? It gets back to the same idea, simple Calvinism. And I think that, the same way Jordan Peterson's sort of fame came from, or at least notoriety, came from having a YouTube channel where he shared his, Introduction to Psychology 101 courses at the University of Toronto, which, I was a student, but before he was a teacher, I was at University of Toronto. And look, those are good classes, but they're sort of basic introductory classes. Part of what he does in those classes is just, standard literary criticism and theory, like I'm literally doing right now. And then when he gets famous or he gets notoriety, it's for, takedowns of pronoun debates and getting involved in the like all meat diet and stuff like that. And they're totally disconnected, right? Those are his own subjective opinions, which he's then trying to, make a false claim are connected to the objective facts he was teaching at a university, which is, really pernicious because he's trying to take the name and the brand of the university and then embed his own thoughts within it. And I think Huberman did something, very similar with Stanford. Anyhow, back to Foster Wallace, who I don't think he ever bragged about being a teacher at Illinois State, or tried to give credit to his writing from the university. I'm now 33 years old. Ooh, speaking of the Bible, there's a Jesus reference. And it feels like much time has passed and is passing faster and faster every day. Day to day, I have to make all sorts of choices about what is good and important and fun. And then I have to live with the forfeiture of all other options those choices foreclose. And I'm starting to see how as time gains momentum, my choices will narrow and their foreclosures multiply exponentially until I arrive at some point on some branch of all life's sumptuous branching complexity at which I am finally locked in and stuck on one path. And time speeds me through stages of stasis and atrophy and decay, until I go down for the third time, all struggle for naught, drowned by time. It is dreadful. But since it's my own choices that'll lock me in, it seems unavoidable. If I want to be any kind of grown-up, I have to make choices and regret foreclosures and try to live with them. Really nice passage. And more relevant and present now than ever. The struggle, I think, that people have to be grown-ups and to be adult and take on responsibility in a world that's so flooded with the idea of fun, entertainment, and a lack of responsibility. Got to throw this quote in here because, I'm a lover of Vietnam and an off visitor. Apparently, Fort Lauderdale Airport is always just your average sleepy mid-size airport 6 days a week, and then every Saturday resembles the fall of Saigon. This reference, if you've never seen an actual photo of the fall of Saigon in 75, it was absolute mayhem and pandemonium. And you can famously still visit this building, and I highly recommend you do. And what is now downtown Ho Chi Minh City, atop this tower, this was one of the last helicopters to get out, and this is loading on American citizens or allies of America from the Southern proxy government. And basically people were just flooding out of the city. There's some wonderful documentaries about this. Now, almost 50 years. Wow, next year is going to be the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon. A fascinating thing. Highly recommend doing some reading up on that. There's a fantastic novel called The Novel with No Name, I believe. Is that what it's called? Yeah, the book with no name. Novel with No Name by Yung Tu Huang. So this is an account of basically a jaded or too far gone soldier fighting for the northern side. And I believe it's read now in Vietnam, but I think this was a banned book for a while. No, this is a different novel. Anyways, let's see what Goodreads has to say about The Novel with No Name, because we always love a good book shout and reference on the Noodlehead. Oh, look at that blank background behind me. That's intense. 28-year-old Quan has been fighting for the communist cause in North Vietnam for a decade. Filled with idealism and hope when he first left his village, he now spends his days and nights dodging stray bullets and bombs, foraging for scraps of food to feed himself and his men. So this is the idea, of course, that the conflict kind of destroyed generations on both sides, right? I mean, of course, most Americans will be familiar with the idea that, the Vietnam War really ripped open and tore apart American society in the wake. And the same thing happened here in many ways in Vietnam. So, reminiscent of All Quiet on the Western Front and The Red Badge of Courage, a breathtakingly original work. Highly recommend that one. You should definitely pick up a copy and read The Novel Without No Name. So he's describing now Foster Wallace. He's still in line. He hasn't even boarded the ship. If we're talking about the chronology of the things here, we're about 20 pages into the essay, and he's yet to embark and leave Fort Lauderdale. So it's funny, but so many wonderful descriptions. Way up ahead, the retired Chicago couple has spread a sort of parasol. There's a bumpy, false ceiling of mackerel clouds moving in from the southwest. But overhead it's just wispy cirrus, and it's seriously hot, standing and waiting in the sun, even without luggage or luggage angst, and through a lack of foresight, I'm wearing my undertakerish black wool suit coat and an inadequate hat, but it feels good to perspire. Great stuff. So, I think the reference here is not only to an undertaker, like in the classical sense, but to The Undertaker, the WWF wrestler who wore a big black coat and had long, scraggly hair, just like David Foster Wallace did. So this is a classic 90s shout. Yeah, he looked something like this over my shoulder. I mean, you'd have to see him more in the 90s, but this is the comparison, that great action figure over my head. And let's get a look at David Foster Wallace side by side, see if we can get an old one. So, I mean, it's there. Something like this, maybe. David Foster Wallace as the Undertaker in a self-referential bit of 90s pomp. Whenever we go over bumps or train tracks, there's a tremendous mass clicking sound in here from all the cameras around everybody's neck. I haven't brought any sort of camera and feel a perverse pride about this. So this is kind of funny, right? That he's wallowing in the idea he doesn't have a camera. These are, of course, actual analog click film cameras. So nobody would have been able to actually like ape and look at the image as they were taking them the way we all do on phones or DSLRs now. So he has no idea about what's being recorded. It's a different kind of film photography. But Wallace, who's already told us he's filling 3 Mead notebooks, which are, big, thick suckers, like school book size notebooks like this. He's said he's going to bring and fill 3 of them on his week-long trip. And he's now saying he's taking pride because he's not clipping away, taking photos at the pier like everyone else. Pretty funny. It's a character. This guy must have been a character for sure. Now he's talking about the books he's seen. I love this. Close to a dozen confirmed sightings of J. Redfield's The Celestine Prophecy, which, if you were around in this era, this book, I mean, my mother and every single one of her friends read it. It was an absolute banger of the book club set. The Celestine Prophecy, an adventure, discusses various psychological and spiritual ideas rooted in multiple ancient Eastern traditions and New Age spirituality. The main character undertakes a journey to find and adventure a series of 9 spiritual insights in an ancient manuscript in Peru. The book's a first-person narrative of spiritual awakening as he goes through a transitional period of his life. I love it. This is like in the same vein as Zen and the Art of the Motorcycle Maintenance, or any of Paul Coelho's books. So I'll link those for you for sure. But this kind of stuff cracks me up. I love this type of reading. And really, I'm not making fun of it. Like, I've read Paul Coelho's books. I mean, they're just a very particular kind of escapism. I think in a kind of escapism that's gone in the way of literature and writing towards memoir and Eat, Pray, Love, which was certainly influenced by this book, by a supposedly funny thing I'll never do again. This is before the huge memoir craze and James Frey hits with tiny little pieces, a million little pieces. And Foster Wallace didn't ever write a memoir, but there's a memoir through all of these works of his essays and also through the interview, the Rolling Stones interview transcript that's available as although of course you end up becoming yourself. So here he is in his cabin, finally on board. I'm not sure if they're at sea yet. Cabin service is in addition to the 11 scheduled daily opportunities for public eating, and it's available 24/7, and it's free. All you have to do is hit X72 on the bedside phone, and 10 or 15 minutes later, a guy who wouldn't even dream of hitting you up for a gratuity appears with this tray. Thinly sliced ham and Swiss cheese on white bread with Dijon mustard. The combo Cajun chicken with pasta salad and spicy salsa. On and on. A whole page of sandwiches and platters in the service directory, and the stuff deserves to be capitalized, believe me. As a kind of semi-agoraphobe who spends massive amounts of time in my cabin, I come to have a really complex dependency/shame relationship with cabin services. Oh man, the stuff is so great. It reminds me, it's funny and ironic looking back that he was so excited about it being 24 hours a day and 10 or 15 minutes a ham sandwich is going to show up. Where we've gotten to the point culturally where, like, with Uber Eats and what's the golden one? I mean, we expect to be able to literally order any meal from any restaurant in America at any hour of the day and have it arrive on our doorstep. I mean, the dream of Amazon and everyone else now is, of course, to have robots delivering us, right? Like, we're so close to the world of the Jetsons and Star Trek and food and goods and our material existence literally just being able to materialize in front of us, that I think it would have been hard for DFW to imagine this in the mid 90s. I mean, he's for sure playing up the quaintness of being a Midwestern American boy who's excited by Cajun chicken or pasta salad and salsa. But it's also not silly, but it's incredible to see where we've gone in 30 years, right? This is a very quaint sort of thing to get excited about. Excited he is, though. Okay, next passage. I want to read this sentence, but it's like a full half a page or something. Oh, you know what? I'm going to go for it. It's him talking about Petra, the cabin cleaner attendant, who he's at least feigning a crush on in a sort of Seinfeld-esque way. Pace the guilt and nagging, etc. A mom cleans up after you largely because she loves you. You're the point, the object of the cleaning somehow. On the nadir, he calls the ship the nadir, i.e. like the low point of a star's cycle. And I think it's because the actual ship name is Zenith. Sorry, digressions aside. So he's calling the Zenith the nadir, i.e. he's making it flipped. Once the novelty and convenience have worn off, I begin to see that the phenomenal cleaning really has nothing to do with me. It's been particularly traumatic for me to realize that Petra's cleaning cabin 1009 so phenomenally well simply because she's under orders to do so, and thus, obviously, that she's not doing it for me or because she likes me or thinks I'm no problem or a funny thing. In fact, she'd clean my cabin just as phenomenally well even if I were a dork. And maybe conceivably behind the smile does consider me a dork. In which case, what if in fact I really am a dork? I mean, if pampering and radical kindness don't seem motivated by strong affection and thus don't seem somehow affirm one or help assure one that one is not finally a dork, of what final and significant value is all this indulgence and cleaning? Okay, there's a lot to unpack there, but basically he's getting this idea, obviously, of his own anxiety about dorkiness or nerdiness, which, I think at root he can't know is not true. I mean, David Foster Wallace is a dork. Anyone who writes a 1,100-page novel or obsessively details, the product service lineup at a tennis tournament is pretty much by definition a dork. I mean, let's look up the old dork definition because I love a good dork. A contemptible, socially inept person. Yeah, we're going to go ahead and say David Foster Wallace is pretty socially inept. I mean, he's already referenced multiple times his agoraphobia and other faux pas he's making at the dinner table. So if he isn't a dork in real life, he's certainly playing one in this essay. It's wonderful stuff, though, and then creating characters. One of the things a good story, a good piece of writing, a good film or movie does, a video, is create these characters. And by surrounding himself with characters, right? He's got Petra, he's got Mr. Dermatitis. These people that he probably had, next to no actual social interaction with. They're taking on in his mind and in the story and in our minds as readers this larger-than-life sort of drama or ongoing melodrama, right? It's almost like a Chekhovian play or something like that, where you have all the mundanities of the doctor in his day doing his rounds. It's David Foster Wallace, Dr. DFW, doing the rounds of the boat. And of course, self-diagnosing. The feeling's not all that dissimilar to the experience of being a guest in the home of somebody who does things like sneak in the AM and make your guest bed up for you while you're in the shower, and fold your dirty clothes, or even launder them without being asked to, or who empties your ashtray after each cigarette you smoke, etc. For a while, with a host like this, it seems great. You feel cared about and prized and affirmed and worthwhile, etc. But then after a while you begin to intuit that the host isn't acting out of regard or affection for you so much as simply going around obeying the imperatives of some personal neurosis having to do with domestic cleanliness and order, which means that since the ultimate point and object of cleaning isn't you, but rather cleanliness and order, it's going to be relief for her when you leave. Okay, so to unravel this one, I think this is really personal for him. I mean, this has got to have to do with some mommy issues stuff. There's a lot of this domestic cleanliness and order, which of course goes back to maternalism and, this idea of the matron, and it's ever present in the mother character in Infinite Jest. And I think that it caused some falling out with DFW and his mother. And yeah, this obsessive caring and detailing and overprotectiveness, really, right? Overprotectiveness is infantilizing in that a mother is overprotecting her child and refusing to allow it to grow up and become an adult. I think it's pretty clear that this is being self-evidenced by the author in this passage. Anyways, I like it. I like this one. It's nice too. You can see we're starting to. I think there's a arc or a line here where we're going. Oh, sorry, I don't have the book back up. Where we're getting back into the ship shape. We're going on kind of wave, a character, a story arc with Foster Wallace, and just in a literary sense, he's starting to really bring us in with him and bring us down into the nadir. The cabin is 13 size 11 keds long by 12 keds wide, with a little peninsular vestibule protruding out toward a cabin door that's got 3 separate locking technologies and trilingual lifebolt instructions bolted to inside, and a whole deck of do not disturb cards hanging from the inside knob. A great Keds reference here. Again, it's at least the second time, along with the trench coat, that Foster Wallace has referenced how he dressed. And of course, him not looking anything at all like the, lounge chair, sunning themselves, tanning set that's usually going to be on this boat trip. And it's part of his distinguish himself, right? Separating himself, making him an outcast or a loner, a social agoraphobe. And also, I think he's trying to at least get in this bit that he's got a little hipster in him, right? I mean, the guy wearing the trench coat and the Keds in the 90s is very Kevin Smith, Silent Bob. Right? This look, a look that is out there with The Undertaker, but also with David Foster Wallace. It's a very 90s sort of cool artist thing. Looks like Silent Bob's got a pair of Jordan 4s on there. Man, that is awesome. He is wearing a great old pair of sneakers. Not only a noodlehead, also a sneakerhead for sure. Let's see these shoes. They are definitely Nike trainers. They're not Jordan 4s. They might be the old Andre Agassi tennis pair. What an incredible look. And then the back behind the scenes stuff. So this too is part of David Foster Wallace's thing, right? His whole take is that he's going to bring you behind the scenes of what? Of reality, of the sort of veil of consumerism that's being put up in front of reality. And he's going to eliminate it or take it back. There you go. Kevin Smith. While I was cleaning my office today, I found my 1999 Silent Bob coat. It's a great look. And then, someone on the internet making fun of him. All good. Okay. We're 50 pages in now to this essay. 50 pages in. We're about almost an hour into the... Oh, my goodness. So this essay is 90 pages long, 80 pages long. We're almost an hour into the talk, the podcast, the chat, whatever you want to call this. But we're just going to keep going. I want to talk about the whole thing today. I want to do it in one piece. So hopefully you're sticking with me. You're enjoying it. Always appreciate a good chat, conversation. So let's get that going. I cannot convey to you the sheer and surreal scale of everything. The towering ship, the ropes, the ties, the anchor, the pier, the vast lapis lazuli dome of the sky. The Caribbean is, as ever, odorless. The floor of Deck 12 is tight-fitted planks of the same kind of corky and good-smelling wood you see in saunas. Looking down from a great height at your countrymen waddling in expensive sandals into poverty-stricken ports is not one of the funner moments of a 7NC luxury cruise, however. There's something inescapably bovine about an American tourist in motion as part of a group. A certain greedy placidity about them. Us, rather. Well, this starts, almost starting to get sad, right? The ugly ones. He's calling them cows. He's saying they look like, fat or overweight or overfed cows, mocking their sandals, of course, in contrast to his own kids. And this is kind of stuff where I feel as a reader now, looking back, I don't know what I felt in my original reading, but there's a kind of sadness here, obviously, that, he can't fit in with them. He's incapable of enjoying himself, or at least the character he's creating in this essay is. And, he's not even, there's him talking of the sadness of people who aren't, in good shape or aren't enjoying the walkabout. But there's this deeper connection here where he's not leaving the boat, right? He's on deck. He's not doing the port of call trips with them. So he's literally sort of entrapped himself on the boat. I think I'm going to need to turn this down. Getting a little overexposed. Whatever. We'll just go with it. Doesn't matter. It's all about the words, anywho. So he says, I make a big deal of carrying my own cafeteria tray, and am effusive in my thanks for the slightest service. Since so many of my shipmates shout, I make it a point of special pride to speak extra quietly to the crewmen whose English is poor. So again, there's this desperation almost to be an everyman or to fit in. And he's a professor. He's the son of a professor and a psychologist or a psychiatrist, I think, but a very white-collar academic-y background. I think his dad was maybe in philosophy and his mother in linguistics or something like that. I can't remember exactly, but, this is a guy whose attempts to connect or to seem blue-collar or working class are pretty feigned, right? He went to Amherst, an extremely elitist, very upper-class private university or college in the East Coast. He is wants this stuff, but the reality is he's not part of it. I think maybe we can look at the tennis stuff and then later at the political stuff in Up Simba, but it's again a real part of him, wanting to be American, wanting to be a part of Americana, but having grown up in such a sort of privileged or exceptional background. And I think that affected how he viewed himself. I'm going to change the camera lighting here. Looking too bright. Oh. There we go. Back in action. I know you're probably not looking at me and it doesn't really matter anyways, but, sometimes you just got to be finicky with this kind of stuff. It's a special point of pride for me, the optics. Okay, so here he kind of admits this, right? I feel like he's taking us on this journey and he's bringing us to the low point of his own despair on the ship. This despair reaches its peak in port, i.e. its nadir, at the rail, looking down at what I can't help being one of. Whether up here or down there, I'm an American tourist, and am thus ex officio, large, fleshy, red, loud, coarse, condescending, self-absorbed, spoiled, appearance-conscious, ashamed, despairing, and greedy. The world's only known species of bovine carnivore. It's an intense point of self-inflection here. It's one that I wonder, too, is America seems like such a divided place now, so divisive, and it doesn't feel that way then. He was really trying to, it feels to me reading this essay that there's two identities present, right? There's not two Americas. and if there is, it's a blue collar sort of white collar thing. But what there really is the loner artist individual, the sort of nomadic Generation Xer who feels themselves in their own solipsistic bubble. And then there's American society at large. But still, it's a single collective identity of Americanness, which David Foster Wallace is trying to, reconcile himself with. I remember reading somewhere that jet skis are incredibly dangerous and accident prone, and I take a certain unkind comfort in this as I watch blonde guys with washboard stomachs and sunglasses on fluorescent cords buzz around making hieroglyphs of foam. Just a gorgeous sentence, also about gorgeous Baywatch boy, kind of Zac Efron, David Hasselhoff shout. This is nice. He loves the chit chat, right? I mean, his favorite part of being a so-called journalist or an essayist was definitely recording the talk, the chatter with other people, interviewing the behind-the-scenes characters, which he really gets into at the tennis tournament, and then also at on the political trail with John McCain, which I think has got to be my favorite of his nonfiction pieces. I experienced a sudden rush of grievance against Harper's Magazine for booking me on the MV Nadir instead of the Dreamword. I calculate by the eye breadth of the gap I'd have to jump or repel to switch to the Dreamword, and I mentally sketch out the paragraphs that would detail such a bold and William T. Volmanish bit of journalistic daring do as literally jumping from one 7C megaship to the other. This is funny too, right? He can't help but compare himself to these other sort of young novel writers or fiction writers under 40 or whatever he said. He referenced it in the essay we were reading yesterday, the TV and fiction essay. But William T. Vollmann is this like prosaic and prolific author who he sometimes gets talked about as, if another American after Toni Morrison is going to win the Nobel Prize, it could be him. Although I guess Bob Dylan did win the Nobel Prize after Toni Morrison. But if another American book writer, we'll say, as opposed to Bob Dylan, who's a songwriter, really. Vollmann's, pretty incredible. His young stuff is pretty intense. He went to Afghanistan in the 80s. I think he was in Serbia, Croatia, Yugoslavia, watched a friend get shot beside him, like doing reportage. Later he was in Thailand trying to uncover human trafficking, and then he was very much sort of embedded into the San Francisco Tenderloin, culture and life of homelessness is the wrong word, but itinerance, drug culture, the underbelly, so to speak, of the Tenderloin. William Vollmann inserted himself in it and wrote a bunch of nonfiction and some fiction as well, because he writes an insane amount. His pantheon's got to be up in the 10,000 pages or something ridiculous like that. So, Foster Wallace envies William Vollmann the way he envies wanting to jump from one cruise ship to the other cruise ship. I know that the syndrome's cause is not simply the contempt bred of a week's familiarity with poor old Nadir, and that the source of all the dissatisfaction isn't the Nadir at all, but rather plain old humanly conscious me, or, more precisely, that the American part of me that craves and responds to pampering and passive pleasure, the dissatisfied infant part of me, the part that always and indiscriminately wants. I feel like this is getting at, the American reality, right? The American of Amazon. Everything is about wanting and full-time consumerism now. All social media has been co-opted into a single living room shopping room, right? The shopping mall of the 90s, which was sort of the third space before Starbucks appeared as the third space for Americans to socialize and talk, and getting into that sort of Robert Putnam Bowling Alone thing, a book I'd love to discuss. I'll link it below, and then Actually, we're not going to get off into it. I'm just going to keep talking. But this is, you know, this is the worry, right? He's playing it up in this essay, but his worry is that this ship and this cruise is, of course, a metaphor, an analogy for America itself and the pop culture and cultural premise of what's happening to America in the 90s, which, as it's circling back to again today, possibly, America in the 90s was a violent place. Look up the statistics. There was a huge amount of crime when I was growing up as a kid, and it kind of peaked in that era. And who knows, maybe it will cycle back, maybe it won't. But the promise to sate the part of me that always and only wants is the central fantasy the brochure is selling. He's talking about the print advertising for the ship. The thing to notice is that the real fantasy here isn't that this promise will be kept, but that such a promise is keepable at all. This is a big one, this lie. Let's get into the footnote. Let's do our first footnote. It may well be the big one, come to think of it. Yeah, that's probably an important one to read. So, the thing to notice here is that the real fantasy isn't that the promise will be kept, but that such a promise is keepable at all. This is a big one, this lie. Possibly the big one in life, right? Just talking about Frank Conroy, who is paid to write an essay promoting the cruise ship. So, death and Conroy notwithstanding, we're maybe now in a position to appreciate the lie at the heart of the celebrity's brochure. For this, the promise to sate part of me that always and only wants. And I think this is what he's talking about, the big lie. The big lie about American culture is that consumerism can satiate desire or want, when in reality it's probably exponential. And just like the time is asymptotically being divided to split up your attention into smaller and smaller bits and pieces and chunks and stocks and futures and, whatever. What is a 1/1,000,000th of a Bitcoin? The Satoshi? We're going to infinitely divide your time and attention. Well, he's talking about wants, and as your wants infinitely divide and become exponentially greater and greater, it's actually harder and harder to be fulfilled or satiated, to be content. So we continue. This is the crux of the piece, folks. This is the absolute crux of the essay. We've just crossed the 1 hour mark here, talking about David Foster Wallace, a supposedly funny thing I'll never do again, the title piece of the cruise ship, from deep diving into a bunch of these essays and pieces this week and really enjoying the revisit of them. So I'm glad to have you here chatting along with me about them. And David Foster Wallace is coming to the crux here, that the infantile part of him is insatiable, and that this is the sort of central aspect or feature of American culture in the late 1990s. Consumer culture is insatiable, unquenchable, discontent. In fact, its whole essence, or Dasein, or whatever, lies in its a priori insatiability. In response to any environment of extraordinary gratification and pampering, the insatiable infant part of me will simply adjust its desires upward until it once again levels out at its homeostasis of terrible dissatisfaction. Woo! We should put a big one on that. We should put a red or green. Oof, hard to choose. Red means lift the quote. Green means green light, all systems go. Yeah. That's clicking for me. Okay. How far along are we here? I think we've still got about 20 or 30 pages left in the essay. So we'll see how this goes. We're an hour into our talk on it. The library is open for checkout of games, cards, and books. Location, 9:30 hours. So again, he's doing this essayistic as a kind of journal, diary format. The library is all good wood and leather and three-way lamping, an extremely pleasant place, but it's open only at weird and inconvenient times. Only one wall is even shelved, and most of the books are the sort of books you see on coffee tables of older people who live in condominiums near unchallenging golf courses. Folio-sized, color-plated, with titles like Great Villas of Italy and famous tea sets of the modern world. God, this Just makes me think of Donald Trump. I don't know why. That silly gold-plated villa thing that he owns in Florida and the golf course nearby it, and the fact that I'm sure, he's this guy, right? He buys and builds golf courses to make them seem easy for himself to try and pump and trump himself up. To who? I guess Americans, I guess the world. A very, very odd feature. I'd be fascinated to think what Foster Wallace would have thought of Trump as politician. It'd be an incredible take to hear about. And I think that in some ways, hopefully we'll visit this, Johnny Gentle, the president in Infinite Jest. Is it Johnny Gentle? I think it's Johnny Gentle, the president in the satirical political aspect of Infinite Jest. In some ways resembles parody of Ronald Reagan, the B actor from Hollywood, soap salesman. And of course, Donald Trump is a sort of later reincarnation of that, of a TV salesman, over the top, ridiculous character, a caricature, becoming the leader of the free world, of America. Okay. My attempts at technical notes are bleeding out into the paper napkins until the yellow letters are all ballooned and goofy like subway graffiti. I think I have that one highlighted just because it's a lovely image. The Windsurf Cafe's coffee, which burbles merrily from spigots and big brushed steel dispensers. The coffee is, quite simply, the kind of coffee you marry somebody for being able to make. Well, this coffee, folks, that I'm holding in my hand is fantastic. Imported from the highlands of Vietnam, it is the kind of coffee that would make you fall in love with the lat. I normally have a firm and neurologically imperative 1 cup limit on coffee, but the Windsurf's coffee is so good, and the job of deciphering the big yellow Rorschachian blobs of my navigational lecture notes so taxing that on this day I exceed my limit by rather a lot, which may help explain why the next few hours of this log get kind of kaleidoscopic and unfocused. I think, too, he's setting us up for what he does format-wise in this essay. Infinite Jest was supposedly based on a Sierpinski gasket. We're not going to get into the David Foster Wallace sort of math piece, but claimed, Foster Wallace did, that Infinite Jest is based on this structure of a Sierpinski gasket, which is incredibly complex and in-depth. It would be something like this, like a breaking down of triads into smaller and smaller triads, which is fascinating. And I think somewhere out there is a mathematician who one day will take on in a dissertation how Infinite Jest was originally meant to be a Sierpinski gasket, but then it actually got edited down quite a bit and lost pieces of it. Just like I'm losing my thinking here. But yeah, we're getting into this kaleidoscopic, unfocused structure, which I think is a bit of BS here. This is a hoax. What he's actually doing is a kind of Great Shark Attack, Hunter S. Thompson thing where he's intentionally spooling and unraveling the structure of his writing to make us go along for this wild ride with him. And notice too, when he lets down his guard, so to speak, with the structure, this is also when he starts to, quote unquote, have fun. He starts to actually participate and dive into the on deck activities, right? So he's hitting golf balls and he's playing ping pong and he's shooting skeet off the back deck. And then later he's at supper and he's being social. So he's introducing all these new characters. In other words, he's no longer playing the agoraphobic loner. He's now, literally chatting up the neighbors at dinner's daughter. So he's being the opposite, the gentleman suitor, the charming, witty character. And this, I told you, there's going to be a character arc in this essay. There is a character arc. But the supper's tensest development is that Alice's mother and my own new friend Trudy, whose purslane and endive salad, rice pilaf, and tender medallions of braised veal are simply too perfect tonight to engage any of her critical attention, and who I should mention has all week made little secret of the fact that she's not exactly crazy about Alice's serious boyfriend Patrick, or about his and Alice's serious relationship, that Trudy notices and misconstrues my and Alice's coded gestures and stifled giggles as signs of some kind of burgeoning romantic connection between us, and Trudy begins yet once again extracting and spreading out her purse's 4x5 photos of Alice and relating little tales of Alice's childhood designed to make Alice appear adorable and talking Patrick down, and in general, I have to say, acting like a procuress. And this would be bad enough, tension-wise, especially when Esther gets into the act. But now poor Alice, who even though deeply preoccupied with birthday deprivation and Mona hatred, is by no means dim or unperceptive, quickly sees what Trudy's doing, and, apparently terrified that I might possibly share her mother's misperception of my connection with her as anything more than an anti-Mona alliance, begins directing my way a kind of Ophelia-type mad monologue of unconnected Patrick references and Patrick anecdotes, all of which causes Trudy to start making her weird, dentally asymmetric grimace at the same time she begins cutting at her tender medallions of braised veal so hard that the sound of her knife against the 5CR's bone china gives everybody at the table tooth shivers, and the mounting tension causes fresh sweat stains to appear in the underarms of my funereal sport coat and spread nearly to the perimeter of the faded salt remains of Pier 21's original sweat stains. And when Tibor makes his customary post-entree circuit of the table and asks how is all of everything, I am, for the first time since the educational second night, unable to say anything other than fine. Wow. That was a whirligig whirlwind of a sentence. Semicolons, ands, connectors, all kinds of in-references and jokes. But you see what I mean here? This build-up, whirlwind, sort of maelstrom of characters and people and flashes, a carnivalesque kind of writing, I think gets back to the great Hunter S. Thompson reportage of the Kentucky Derby, or of course Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. And, when you go to a sporting event and then come back with nothing but his drug-addled, adventurous, Quixote-esque tales. Yeah, love this stuff. So, let's get into a few references. No. Are we almost at the end? Or was that the end? No, okay. I thought for a second that was the end. That was the end of his section. Oh my goodness, I would have been freaked out if I'd literally just read the whole end of the essay. But we're 4 pages away from the appendix, folks. So we should just go for it. An hour and 12 minutes in. Thanks for being with me. Keep noodleheading. Please note, video and audio taping of all shows is strictly prohibited. Children, please remain seated with your parents during shows. No children in the front row. Celebrity Show Lounge. We're here to see the whole hypnotist. Oh boy. So here we talk about the hypnotism, and I think the whole thing is basically a metaphor that Foster Wallace is putting forth for the idea that you're being hypnotized or lullated or lulled to sleep by the cruise ship itself. This idea that, all of us are sort of being sated with so much food and dance and drink and activities and shore visits and yada yada, that you're hypnotized into not realizing what's going on around you, i.e. that, you're a pampered bovine person being cared for like a baby in real life, in a real world surrounded by real issues and real problems in the Caribbean. So, maybe the single most strikingly comprehensive 7NC symbol, that's the ship, is Nigel Ellery himself. The hypnotist's boredom and hostility are not only undisguised, they're incorporated kind of ingeniously into the entertainment itself. Okay. This could be an exact description of Foster Wallace and his journalistic take. Not the man, not the person, but his take, his eye, his first-person perspective in this essay. Let's read it again. The hypnotist's boredom and hostility are not only undisguised, they're incorporated kind of ingeniously into the entertainment itself. I mean, that's David Foster Wallace, right? Undisguised hostility and boredom incorporated ingeniously into an entertainment. He famously called the video, the book in Infinite Jest, is called The Entertainment. Ellery's boredom gives him the same air of wary expertise that makes us trust doctors and policemen, and his hostility, via the same kind of phenomenon that makes Don Rickles a big star in Las Vegas, I guess, is what gets the biggest roars of laughter from the lounge's crowd, i.e. hostility as entertainment, as act. The guy's stage persona is extremely hostile and mean. Think about Trump here. This is Trump on stage. Extremely hostile and mean. He does unkind imitations of people's U.S. accent. He ridicules questions from subjects and audience. He makes his eyes burn Rasputinishly and tells people they're going to wet the bed at exactly 3 a.m. or drop trow at the office in exactly 2 weeks. You can just imagine this room full of like nervous, intense, gawking laughter, the kind of laughter that, ends in spasmodic shaking. The spectators, mostly middle-aged, it looks like, rock back and forth with mirth, slap their knee and dab at their eyes with hankies. Each moment of naked ill will from Ellery is followed by an enormous circumoral constriction and palms out assurance that he's just kidding, and that he loves us, and we're simply a marvelous bunch of human beings who are clearly having a very good time indeed. Yeah, I don't know. This gives me a creepy sort of flash forward to like huge Trump on stage performances in front of massive audiences where he's just like burningly critical and nasty of his audience and mean and hostile. So let's finish with this big, beautiful last sentence and go through the description. Bum, 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 bum. Where does it even start? Because my own dangerous susceptibility makes it important that I not follow Ellery's hypnotic suggestions too closely or get too deeply involved, I find myself in my comfortable navy blue seat, going farther and farther away inside my head, sort of creatively visualizing a kind of epiphanic Frank Conroy type moment of my own, pulling mentally back, seeing the hypnotist and subjects and audience and celebrity show lounge and deck, and then the whole motorized vessel itself with the eyes of someone not aboard, visualizing the MV Nadir at night right at this moment, steaming north at 21.4 knots, with a strong, warm west wind pulling the moon backwards through a skein of clouds, hearing muffled laughter and music and papas throb and the hiss of receding wake, and seeing, from the perspective of this nighttime sea, the good old Nadir, complexly aglow, angelically white, lit up from within, festive, imperial, palatial, yes, this, like a palace. It would look like a kind of floating palace, majestic and terrible, to any poor soul out here on the ocean at night, alone in a dinghy, or not even in a dinghy, but simply and terribly floating. A man overboard, treading water, out of sight of all land. This deep and creative visual trance, the hypnotist's true and accidental gift to me, lasted all through the next day and night, which period I spent entirely in cabin 1009, in bed, mostly looking out the spotless porthole, with trays and various rinds all around me, feeling maybe a little bit glassy-eyed, but mostly good. Good to be on the nadir. Good soon to be off. Good that I had survived, in a way, being pampered to death, in a way. And so I stayed in bed. And even though the trance stasis caused me to miss the final night's climactic PTS and the farewell midnight buffet, and then Saturday's docking, and a chance to have my after photo taken with Captain G, Panagiotakis. Subsequent re-entry into the adult demands of landlocked real-world life wasn't nearly as bad as a week of absolutely nothing had led me to fear. 1995, David Foster Wallace. A supposedly fun thing I'll never do again. Thanks so much.